There was a pastor who was on a flight. He was going from one place to another, and pretty soon it became apparent that that flight wasn't going to be just a normal flight. The fasten your seatbelt sign came on and got a little bit bumpy in the flight, and pretty soon a voice came over the intercom in the plane, and it says, we're going to be suspending our drink service for the time being. We're going to be encountering some turbulence. There's a storm ahead of us, and the passengers looked a little bit uneasy, but turbulence isn't that unusual in a flight, and pretty soon the weather began to get a little bit worse. Voice came on the radio again, and this time the voice said, we are not going to be serving dinner today. It's really bad out there. We're approaching a storm. And then with a little bit of terror, the flight attendant said, just hold on. And that didn't make anybody in the flight feel real good. And so sure enough, they do hit the turbulence, and this pastor is scared, and he begins to look around the plane, and he sees other people are also scared. And people are praying. He sees people, their mouths are just kind of in prayer. Their eyes are shut. He sees, sweat beginning to pour down people's faces. The plane is literally just being hurled in the air like, some kind of cork on a celestial sea, up and down and up and down. And this pastor, as he tells the story, says there was one passenger on the entire plane who didn't look nervous, and it was this little girl. This little girl is just sitting there while everybody else is kind of freaking out, and she's sitting on her seat, and she's got her feet tucked underneath her. She's got a book open, and she's reading her book, and she's just completely absorbed in her book. Everybody else is freaking out. Every once in a while, she would close her eyes, and then she'd open her eyes back up. And this flight got to the point where people were literally thinking, we're not going to make it. This plane, there is no way in the world this plane is going to make it through this storm. And people are beginning to try to make peace with God. And they're just trying to make sure that, they're ready for the end. Well, the pilot did a marvelous job. He worked their way through that storm, gets them through it. And, the pastor, as they land and they've hit the ground, they're just feeling good, decides to wait around to talk to this little girl. And he says to her, honey, I noticed that this entire flight, you weren't afraid, you weren't freaking out. Everybody else in the flight seemed just distraught. Why weren't you afraid? And she says, well, because my daddy's the pilot. And my daddy's just going to fly us home, and we're okay. My dad's in charge here. And I love that picture. I love that picture of faith in that little girl. The faith that she had in her daddy. And there's just all these parallels that come, with God and the faith that we have in him. And yet, even if you've been a follower of Jesus Christ for years, you know that sometimes the storms of life catch us unaware, right? We've all had those moments. I remember I was in Central America with a group of high school students, had about 65 of them on a mission trip. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then I called my parents on the phone from Guatemala because they were leaving to go on their first mission trip to the country of Turkey, to Istanbul, where they were going to serve missionaries in this Muslim country. And I had the most wonderful conversation with my parents as they were getting ready to go on their first ever mission trip. I'd probably been on 25, 30 mission trips at that point in my life. And it was such a joy to listen to my mom and dad describe what they were looking forward to. They couldn't wait to get to Istanbul. They couldn't wait to see this historic city. They couldn't wait to work with the missionaries and to encourage them. They were going to be working with some missionaries at a printing press who were doing Christian literature. They were going to work with some missionaries with InterVarsity, and they just had all sorts of wonderful things planned. Well, that was about 2 days before I was due to arrive back in the United States. And so our trip ended. I flew those 65 students back. We didn't have any turbulence in our plane. Everything was wonderful. Got back home. And I'd been home for 2 days when I received a phone call from my dad from Istanbul, Turkey. And he was freaking out. He was upset because my mom, over the just few days that she had been in Istanbul, started to display some very strange behavior. It began with just kind of this behavior that looked like she was, maybe having panic attacks. She was starting to say things that didn't make sense. She had almost fainted a couple of times. And then my mom did faint, and she went into a coma on her first ever mission trip. And my parents and my younger sister, who was helping to lead this trip at the time, she was the short-term mission coordinator at her church, found themselves in an incredible storm of life, an ocean away in a Muslim country. And I remember just the days that followed. It didn't look like my mom was going to make it out of that trial. My dad would call a little while later, one of my brothers, and say, I don't think Mom's going to live. Can one of you guys fly and be here with Jenny and me? And my one brother was already out of the country somewhere else, and he couldn't rearrange what was going on. Two of my brothers didn't have passports. I'd been home for about a week after 17 days in Central America, and my brother said, can you get to Istanbul? We'll pay the way. You've got the passport that's working. And my precious wife and my work said, go ahead, go. And so we went, or I went to Istanbul, and I was pretty sure I was going to be taking home my mother's body. What I found at American Hospital in Istanbul was a very different type of medical care. You couldn't, when somebody was in intensive care in Istanbul, actually spend more than 20 minutes a day with your loved one. And so my dad would sit in the waiting room with his wife in a coma, just dying to see her. And the opportunities just weren't there. I had planned on being in Istanbul for 4 days. That's what my dad told me to pack for. And I ended up staying for 3 weeks in Istanbul. Sometimes the storms of life catch you unaware. Now, long story short, my mom came out of her coma. She had encephalitis. She'd been bitten by a mosquito that had taken blood from a horse that had been infected with encephalitis. That's how you get the disease. It's an equine disease. They don't see it a whole lot in Turkey. They didn't know how to help my mother. And my mom has never been the same. She had swelling in her brain. She is an amazing woman. I love still spending time with my mom. There are glimpses of my mom when I'm with her, but it impacted her in ways that she may never, ever, ever get to experience life like before that trip to Istanbul again until she gets to heaven. Those storms of life are tough. It would just be a couple years later that my dad would trip on ice, and many of you prayed for my dad. He broke his neck as he was preparing to move into a retirement home with my mom. Doctors have never seen anybody who has the break that my dad has walk again. It was an incredible trial in their life. It was months before my dad would get out of the University of Chicago Hospital. And today he's this walking miracle, and doctors can't explain how he's walking. He has kind of a bionic neck. It's an amazing thing. And yet that storm of life has been another one of those defining moments. You've had those storms too. Maybe not to that extreme, maybe much more of an extreme than my parents have been through, because both of them are still walking. But sometimes the storms of life can catch us unaware. We find ourselves today in Luke chapter 8, and we're in the 22nd verse. And I want to begin with verse 22, where it just simply says, one day he, and that he is Jesus here, got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, let's go across to the other side of the lake. So they set out. Now, getting on a boat with his disciples was not an unusual thing for Jesus Christ. His disciples were accustomed to the sea. At least 4 of his disciples were career fishermen before they ever met Jesus and began to follow him. They made their living on the sea. When Jesus asked his disciples to get into a boat so that they could go to the other side of the lake, I'm sure that his disciples just assumed that Jesus was taking them to the next pit stop on this journey of spreading the message, the good news of the kingdom of God all over the earth, because that's what they were doing at that point of their life. I'm sure the disciples assumed this is just another trip on the lake with Jesus. The lake that is spoken of here is the Sea of Galilee. It's a lake that many of the disciples had grown up on. Those 4 fishermen that we talked about, this was their home lake. This was a lake they knew well. The Sea of Galilee is located 686 feet below sea level. It's known to be a lake where winds can just whip up, and in just a matter of minutes, storms can arise on this lake that would put people in a first century fishing vessel in a very difficult spot. The The sea itself is located in a deep rift between the Arabian Desert and the Mediterranean Sea that makes it particularly vulnerable to storms. Many of you have seen the film The Perfect Storm. It's the story of the fated voyage of the Andrea Gale and one of the worst storms in the history of our nation. Sailors oftentimes face difficult storms at sea. Nowadays, sailors can at least rely on fantastic data. They can rely on radar. They know when storms are coming their way. But even today, there are stories of shipwrecks that come across the sea. The disciples' boat was a crude first-century fishing boat. Just to get us in the spirit of what we're going to read next, I thought I'd put a video on today of just some stormy seas, and get you in the mood for what it might have been like to be the disciples. Now, keep in mind, they're in a first-century fishing vessel. The video you're going to see are modern-day ships on the ocean, and I hope you don't get too seasick. Here we go. Out there, I have no desire to be on a ship in that kind of weather. I think some of our Coast Guard people and people who are in the Navy are some of the greatest heroes around for having to face water like that. That makes me feel sick just looking at it. And you know what? I think the disciples were feeling sick too, because look what happens next in verse 23. And as they sailed, he, meaning Jesus, fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. Now, some of you have been in a boat where it's taken on too much water in the past, and maybe you know what that's like. That can happen in Lake Mille Lacs. It can happen in Lake Superior. It can happen just about anywhere if the weather conditions aren't right. It wasn't exactly the plan for the disciples to be in a boat that was taking on water in the Sea of Galilee, but that's how it is sometimes. Sometimes the storms of life catch us unaware. Sometimes our child gets sick, and we're not prepared for it. And that sickness is a serious illness, and we're completely blindsided. Or sometimes we're at work, and it seems like a normal day. We had a great weekend, and we walk into the office on Monday, and maybe our superiors didn't have as great of a weekend because they spent the weekend talking about the fact that our company was going to have to downsize. And when you're called into the boss's office, you're caught completely unaware. Or maybe you're driving your car on Interstate 494 or 35 or 169 or 52 or any of the other highways here in the Twin Cities. And you are minding your own business and you're driving safe, but there's another driver who can't get off their cell phone. And they're texting and they begin to creep over into your lane. And just like that, you become part of a car accident that causes you injury, and you're caught completely unaware. Maybe the person you love has broken your heart, or your best friend moves to another state. Sometimes the storms of life catch us unaware. And when they do, people generally react in one of three ways. They either react with anxiety, with worry, or with faith. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a second. Isn't anxiety and worry, aren't those just two sides of the same coin? Aren't those the same thing? Well, not completely. Worry is an emotion focused on an actual threat or danger. All right, so when you're worried about something, you're worried because there is knowledge of something that is an actual threat or danger that is right before you. We all know people who worry. Maybe that's you. Some of us know people who worry a lot. I have a friend who lived in North Minneapolis by choice. He was just a few doors away from North High School. And in 1 year's time, his home or his vehicle was vandalized on multiple occasions. And, he felt God called him to live in that neighborhood. And he felt like they were supposed to be there. And I remember talking to him about kind of his neighborhood after about the fifth time that he'd been robbed that year, talking about the fact that in the neighborhood that he lived in North Minneapolis, in that particular year, 9 high school students from North High had been killed in different events that were related to gang warfare kind of outside of school. And I said, what's it like to live in this neighborhood? And he said, I got to be honest with you, sometimes I worry. Sometimes when I'm here at work at night, I worry about my family's safety because my family has experienced threats to their safety. We've had people that have threatened us for living in this neighborhood and people who have told us stories, but we believe this is where God wants us to be. When your company's downsizing, when you find yourself in a spot where there's actual danger, you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night with just this incredible stress on your life about things that you know could happen, then you're experiencing worry. Anxiety is an emotion that is experienced in the face of a perceived threat or danger. When we're dealing with anxiety, we're dealing with a much more generalized fear. It's a fear that sometimes doesn't even make sense. I've talked to men and women who are afraid that their spouse is cheating, not because of anything their spouse has done, but because they know somebody else whose spouse has cheated. Or I've talked to parents who are afraid that their kids are doing drugs, not because their kids are doing drugs, but because they know other parents' kids are doing drugs, and so maybe my kids are doing drugs. I know people who've experienced incredible panic attacks from fear that they're going to be stricken with a terrible disease, even though there's no history in their family of that disease, and there's no reason to believe that they would have that disease. I know people who won't fly because they're afraid that the plane's going to crash, and yet they flew for years with no fear whatsoever. Or people who won't drive because they're afraid of breaking down. I know people who won't pursue their dreams because they're afraid of negative reactions. If I actually do the thing that I feel that maybe God has created me to do, maybe somebody will have a negative reaction to it and I shouldn't do it. My boys and I did what many Americans have been doing this weekend. We watched Back to the Future last night. It's Back to the Future Day in America, if you weren't aware of that. Back to the Future 2's events took place on this day, and so there are theaters all over the Twin Cities that are screening the Back to the Future films today. And in the original Back to the Future film, Marty McFly, the character that was played by Michael J. Fox, travels back in time and he meets his parents when they were in high school. And in this time zone, Marty's a high school musician. He loves to play the guitar. And there's this spot early in the film where he's in the gym and he's trying out for the high school dance. And it's just this great scene, 1985 movie making, with all the teachers who are looking there as he plays his electronic guitar. And the last thing they want him to do is to play the guitar at the school dance. And so his band gets rejected, and his girlfriend comes up to him and says, "Hey, Marty, you're a great musician. You need to get your music out there, and you need to talk to a record company. Record company, isn't that great? And you need to get a recording contract. You are so good." And he says, "Well, what if people don't like it? What if I put myself out there and people don't like it?" And you find out during the film, one of the recurring themes of Back to the Future is that fear and worry and anxiety is something that Marty's dad has, and it kind of passes down to the kids. And Marty never wants to take a risk because his dad never took a risk. And he finds it out when he goes back in time. And so he goes back in time. He sees his dad. His dad's afraid to ask his mom out on a date, has a crush on his mom. And then his dad's a science fiction writer kind of in the closet, but he doesn't want to ever put his science fiction out there because what if somebody doesn't like it? And there's this defining moment in the film, and I'm going to show you a 12-second clip where Marty talks to his dad in the past, and then it kind of goes to the future toward the end of the film when the conversation that Marty had with his dad changed his life. Check out this clip from Back to the Future.
There's nothing to be scared of. All it takes is a little self-confidence. If you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything. Like I've always told you, you put your mind to it, you can accomplish anything.
Yeah, Marty's little pep talk changed his family's future forever and ever. When worry and anxiety go unchecked, it can give way to panic. And so can an intense situation. Have you ever been there? Have you found yourself panicking? I was on an icy road in the mountains of West Virginia with a bunch of high school students when I was a 25-year-old youth pastor. We had gone to the Timberline Resort, which is in the Snow Bowl region of West Virginia. That part of the country gets more snow than anywhere east of the Rocky Mountains. And I was just having a blast with these kids. It was by far the best snow camp we'd ever had when the phone calls began to come in. Now, this is prior to the days of everyone having a cell phone. And so the phone calls were coming to the resort front desk. They were looking for Brian Schulenberg, and it was a bunch of parents from Washington, D.C., who were calling to ask me, when are you going to bring our kids home? Because there's a historic snowstorm that's coming, and it's going to hit you, and if you don't leave soon, you're going to be stuck in West Virginia well into next week. Well, I remember being on the ski slope, and the way they communicated with you is they had kind of a whiteboard, and it said Brian Schulenberg on it. And because I was a little bit clueless, I didn't even see the board. Finally, 5 or 6 of my students caught me and said, they're trying to get you, Brian. They want to talk to you at the front desk. And so I went to the chalet, and sure enough, I have just this stack of messages from parents wondering when we're going to bring their kids home. We were completely oblivious to the fact that a huge snowstorm was coming. And I remember being on this road driving back. I mean, we made the very quick decision, let's head back. But it was too late. And what should have been a 5-hour trip from West Virginia to Washington, D.C., became a trip that took us about 14 hours. And I remember just being in these 15-passenger rental vans that are never quite safe. You know, you're in these things and you wonder, how are we doing? The tires are never quite, the tread isn't where they should be. And I remember driving one of these vans, and I remember watching as the van in front of me ended up skidding and going into the ditch. I hit the same patch of ice, tried to overcompensate, couldn't do it, ended up in the ditch, and the van behind me just missed the ditch. So we had all these vans, we're in the ditch, and I remember there's this sheer panic as I'm going toward the ditch, just crying out to Jesus in prayer, Lord, don't let this van flip over. Lord, don't let this van flip over. Lord, don't let any of these kids get hurt. I'm reminded of that Carrie Underwood song, Jesus, Take the Wheel. I mean, that's how I felt in that moment. When the disciples found themselves in a situation worthy of panic, you know what they did? They kind of cried out, Jesus, take the wheel. They cried out to the one who was the only one who could do anything about it. The disciples went to the right place with their panic. Look at the beginning of verse 24. And they went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. Although I think it sounded more like this, Master, Master, we're perishing. I think they were just freaking out. They were scared to death, and you would be too. You ever had those moments? And maybe it isn't a car ride, and maybe it isn't a plane ride. Maybe it's, Master, Master, my family is falling apart. Master, Master, my marriage is falling apart. Master, Master, this addiction is tearing me up. Master, Master, help. The disciples approached God in sheer panic, and what was Jesus doing? What was God doing? He was sleeping. Say that again. God was asleep. And you don't have to worry about that. You don't ever have to worry about God being asleep on the job. Listen, when Jesus was sleeping, he was 100% God too. And so he knew what was going on. He was well aware of the situation. But isn't it good to know that we have a God who's aware of what's happening in our lives? Storms are oftentimes God's way of bringing us into a deeper walk with him. God seems to move in mighty ways when we feel like our backs are against the wall. He seems to wake us in those moments from our spiritual slumber. This past week, our students in the School of Discipleship read the book by Paul Miller, The Praying Life. If you've never read The Praying Life by Paul Miller, I want to encourage you to write the name down and When you go home today, before you do anything else, go to Amazon or whatever your favorite retailer is and order the book and start reading it, because it's one of these books that, for those of you who struggle with prayer, it is just a unique way, and very, very much just a lot of testimony from his own life of how God works through prayer. And there's this great quote in Miller's book. There's tons of great quotes. It's hard to pick one, but this is the one I wanted to pick for today. He says, God takes everyone he loves through a desert. It is his cure for our wandering hearts, restlessly searching for a new Eden. Here's how it works. The first thing that happens is we slowly give up the fight. Our wills are broken by the reality of our circumstances. The things that brought us to life gradually die, and our idols die for lack of food. Love that. So tired of these idols that continually creep up in my life. And I know that many of you are tired of the idols that seek to take the attention and the worship and the praise that God and God alone deserves from your life. And it's time for us to recognize that Jesus Christ is our only hope. Sometimes God gives us a storm so that we'll come back to him. He wants us to live lives of dependence on him, and that seems foreign in a land where we're taught to be self-sufficient, to look out for number one, or to be independent. When the disciples came to Christ for help, Jesus showed himself to be the Lord of creation. Look at the end of verse 24. And he awoke, and he rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was calm. Now that's something new. I mean, up to this point, we've seen Jesus do some spectacular things. He has healed people who are sick. He's cast out demons. He has, at this point, even raised a dead person back to life. But the disciples had never seen Jesus do anything like this. He awakens, and it is words, the winds, and the waves obey him. Think back to that video we watched of the ships being, torn to and fro by the waves. Now, I don't know that the storm on the Sea of Galilee looked like that. I'm guessing not. I'm guessing they were taking in water. They were freaking out. They probably weren't getting anywhere. And the more water that came in, the less it seemed that they were able to get water out. They were desperate for sure. But this is a God. This is in their minds, the God-man, 100% God, 100% human, and the incarnation was Jesus Christ, who with his very breath speaks, and the winds and the waves stop. And what it showed the disciples was that Jesus Christ is the creator of life. He is the sustainer of life. He is the goal of the universe. He showed them that he was more than capable of helping them through the storms of life, and I hope that you believe that today. Remember that I mentioned that people generally react to the life storms in one of three ways. They either react with anxiety, with worry, or with faith. We've talked about anxiety and worry. When the disciples came to Jesus with their fear, he took care of their problem. And even the wind and the waves were no problems. And then he says this in verse 25. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?" I love how Jesus addresses the disciples and then miraculously calms the storm. He says, "Where's your faith?" I kind of wonder how he said that. I wonder if he said, "Where's your faith?" Kind of gently, where's your faith, guys? I think some people wonder if Jesus said that angrily. "Where's your faith? Come on, get with it." Or maybe he said it with more of an exhortation type voice. "Where's your faith, guys?" I think that's kind of where it comes from, where it stems from. He's exhorting them. He says, "Come on, you have witnessed so many incredible events. Do you think I'd put you on this boat and allow you to go through the storm and not take care of you?" I love how Jesus addresses the disciples with that question. Where's your faith? The Bible doesn't give us the luxury of answering that question any other way as followers of Jesus Christ than answering how we should. Well, God, it should be in you. Faith is a decision. I'm going to say that. Faith is a decision to place our trust in the one who can handle threats or danger. that we may experience in life. Faith is a decision to place our trust in the one who can handle any threats or danger that we can experience in this life. Does that mean we won't go through threats and danger? No. Sometimes following Jesus takes us to some incredibly dangerous places. One of the most distorted kind of misnomers of the last 100 years in Christianity is this idea that Jesus isn't going to take us anywhere that's dangerous, or the safest place to be is in the center of God's will. See, sometimes that's a very dangerous place to be. And God wants us to go and to be obedient and to go to a spot that is a dangerous spot for the sake of the gospel and for him. I think about some of our missionaries who have served in countries where even being in that country means that every day they place their lives and the lives of their families in danger. Why do we think that our lives should be so easy and without storms? The disciples were powerless against that storm, and I think that's part of the lesson too. We're powerless against some of these storms in life, but Jesus isn't. Jesus is the first and the best place that we can go with our anxiety and our fear. And the disciples marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?" Nobody else can do that. Today I want you to internalize this message. I want to make it personal. So I want to end our time here today with taking a look at what we can practically do this week with our fear and anxiety. And number one is this. Let's be honest. Let's identify our fears. And answer the question, are we dealing with anxiety or are we dealing with worry? Remember, worry is an emotion that's based on an actual threat or danger. Anxiety is an emotion that's based on a perceived threat or danger. Last several weeks, I've talked about taking a journal and picking up a journal, or write it down on your cell phone, or type it in your cell phone or your iPad, or however you do that. But write down, place it somewhere, record what it is that those fears are in your life, and whether or not they're true things that you're worrying about, or whether or not it's a perceived danger. Number two, bring your fears to Jesus. Boy, I think I've said this 2 times in the last 3 weeks, because it was just 2 weeks ago that Jesus was dealing with another situation where there were some people who were struggling with fear. Bring your fears to Jesus. You know what? At least the disciples did that right. Master, help us. We're perishing out here. We're dying out here, Jesus. Do you have the faith to do that? To bring your fear to Jesus? Next, replace your anxiety or fear with faith in God's promises. Now, here's the deal. The Bible is full of promises as it relates to anxiety and fear. When you came in today, if you picked up a bulletin, inside your bulletin was an insert that looked like this. These are just a minuscule part of the verses in Scripture that have to do with promises that Jesus has given to us, that God has given to us as it relates to anxiety or fears in our life. Verses that talk about the fact that we can place our trust in Jesus. So we're going to do something a little unusual today. With some music playing very quietly in the background, I want you to take some time for personal reflection. It may be that you're going to read one verse in this piece of paper. That's fine. It may be that you're going to choose this time to use some of the blank space on this paper to just kind of write down what some of those fears and anxieties are, and just begin to give those to God. But we're going to play an old hymn. It's the hymn, "And Can It Be?" And as that hymn plays for several minutes, I want to encourage you to either read this, pray through this time, ask God to speak to you through his word, and ask God to do a work. And then our worship team is going to come up, and we're going to sing a couple more songs.
Interest in the thou, my God, shouldst die for me. He left his Father's throne above, so free, so infinite. His grace emptied himself of all but love and bled for Adam's helpless race. 'Tis mercy all immense and free, for oh my God, it found out me. Amazing love, how can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? Long my imprisoned spirit lay, fast bound in sin and nature's night. Thine eye diffused a quickening ray. I woke the dungeon flamed with light. My chains fell off, my heart was free. I rose, went forth, and followed thee. Amazing love, how can it be that thou,